All right, I am Dr. Dave Anderson. This will be my first time to teach a class with no one sitting there, so if I forget you're there when you're not there, don't be offended. The way we have this class set up is I will give a 1-hour lecture on the material, and then we will have a half-hour of Q&A, which will be live for anyone who can attend it. During the hour lecture, I'll just be going over the material from this book, Free Grace Soteriology. You can get this via a electronic copy on Amazon, but most people like to mark them up. And so if that's your preference, of course, you can order the hard copy or the paperback copy. Now, before we jump into soteriology, it might be good to just orient us to systematic theology. Some have called systematic theology the queen of sciences. And there's a reason for that. It takes in both history and language data and what we call biblical theology. In fact, systematic theology has two roots. If you look at it like a tree, and out on the tree are 11 branches: ecclesiology, hamartiology, anthropology, eschatology, soteriology, all these ologies, where you're studying the church or sin or a man, or Christology, studying Christology, meaning study of. Then that tree, which we call systematic theology, has two roots. The roots are biblical theology and historical theology, and both are equally important. Some people want to camp just on biblical theology, and their historical theology is very weak, and that leads to a weakness in the tree. Your tree will only be as strong as your biblical theology and your systematic theology. Excuse me, your historical theology. So what are they? Well, biblical theology is where, just what it sounds like, you take the Bible and you are looking at what Paul was saying to the Ephesians a couple thousand years ago. So you want to study Ephesus, you study their culture, you study their habits, you study their language, and you draw as many truths as you can just from studying that particular book of the Bible, if you're trying to get the biblical theology of, say, Paul, or what they would call Pauline theology. Of course, to get Pauline theology, you don't just study Ephesians, you go on to Colossians, Philippians, etc. So that's biblical theology, but it only tells you what he was saying to the people 2,000 years ago. That gives you a context in which he spoke, to which he spoke. But to get truth for today, you have to decontextualize, and you do that, you're looking for the timeless truths in the biblical theology. You're looking for truths that will go through the centuries and go through cultures. Truths that would apply in South Africa, and Beijing, and New Orleans in the United States. Also truths that would apply in the 10th century or the 20th century or the 21st century. So those are timeless truths, but to then bring them into the present and to a place, you have to then recontextualize. So you take the timeless truths you found through decontextualization, and then you take them to Sierra Leone, and you see how they apply in that context. That's called recontextualizing. So that's biblical theology, but historical is just as important. For example, we have this continental divide between Protestants and Catholics in Christianity. It's about equally divided. There are about 1 billion Catholics in the world, and there are about 1 billion Protestants in the world. And what do they divide over? Well, a lot of things, but the main thing is over what does it mean to be justified. In the Roman Catholic world, they say justification is linear. It starts, in other words, on a timeline beginning with your water baptism, hopefully as a child, and it goes on all the way till you die, in which you're getting more and more of the character of Christ. Then it's decided when you die whether you're justified or not, so you can go to heaven. If you're close but don't quite make the grade, you get to go to purgatory. If you don't make the cutoff at all, then you go to hell. But that decision is not made until you die. In Protestantism, justification is looked at as a momentary event. It does not mean a change in your character. It's a change in your standing. It's a change in your standing before God. You are changed from a guilty, condemned sinner to be separated from God forever to a completely accepted, declared righteous person. It's a declaration of your righteousness. How does that happen? Well, we say it happens by faith alone, meaning no works, in Christ alone. And when we put our faith in Him, then His perfect life is credited to our account. Well, that's a huge divide. How did that happen? Where did the understanding change? Does it still hold up? Now, that gives you an example of historical theology. Historical theology takes the truths from 2,000 years ago, or if you're in the Old Testament, further back than that, and moves them up till today. And we trace the history of a doctrine as it goes along so we can understand where we are today. It's extremely helpful to understand, for example, the meaning of Augustine's understanding of justification and how it was changed. It wasn't really changed by Martin Luther. It was changed by his tutor, Melanchthon. And it wasn't really changed in 1517. We didn't start reading about it really until the 1530s. So all this is very important. It's very helpful for us to understand how we got to where we are today and how we should properly understand these doctrines. So, a little background there to systematic theology. We're studying one of its branches. We're studying soteriology. Soter, soteria, sozo, these all come from the same root, and it's a root meaning to save or deliver. In fact, if we went to that famous passage in Ephesians 2, 8 and 9, where it says you are saved through faith, here's our English word saved, and over here we find its Greek root or word from which we translate saved, and we just click on it. We get Baruch and Gingrich's Lexicon of the New Testament, the best one-volume lexicon in the world on the New Testament Greek, and it lists several meanings. One is to preserve or rescue from natural dangers, save from death, which is a little a under B. And what we're going to do in this first hour is help make a dictionary on the word saved. We're going to see it has lots of different meanings. And that's very important. For example, this verse says you're saved by grace through faith and not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works. Well, it's not of works, lest anyone should boast. But if we go over here to, say, James 1:21, it says, therefore lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. Well, if you just look at this, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, that essentially says clean up your act. And then it says receive with meekness the implanted word. That means to be a Bible student with the right attitude. And then it says the result would be it can save your soul. Well, that sure looks like works to me, doesn't it to you? Or if we go to, say, Matthew. And we look at this famous passage where Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, this is Matthew 16:24, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever desires to save his life will lose it. Whosoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? So if this is talking about saving souls, how do you do it? Well, according to Jesus, you deny yourself, you take up your cross, and follow him. Does that sound like a free gift, to deny yourself? And when he talks about a cross there, he's not being figurative. He knew he was going to die on a cross. And he said, if you want to follow him, you better be prepared to die on a cross yourself, as many of them did. It's estimated that When Titus's army came through in 70 AD, he killed 1,100,000 Jewish people. And he denuded the country of its wood, of its trees, because he was trying to kill as many as he could on crosses. He took 900,000 captives back to Italy, but he killed over 1 million, according to Josephus. Now, we can't always trust Josephus's numbers, but he's right there looking at all this, and I don't know who did the counting, but he killed a lot of people on crosses. So the cross was a very real danger in that time. Does that sound like salvation without works to you? Most thinking people who are honest will say no. If you get to heaven through self-denial, through taking up your cross, that is certainly not a free gift. And so we have these passages that seem to contradict one another. How can we unravel all this? And that's part of what we want to do in this class. We're going to cover doctrines like regeneration, justification. We'll look at what he has to say about infant salvation, and all across the board. You can see in the table of contents what we're going to be doing. Now, for reading this class, you can just follow along with what I'm doing. Read ahead if you want. I'll roughly try to follow the order of the book. But in your syllabus, you have the direction we're going, and I want you to, of course, do that. Now, the extra reading, Dr. Ryrie's book, So Great Salvation, John MacArthur's book, The Gospel According to Jesus, Zane Hodges' book, and Absolutely Free. I don't care what schedule you read those on. I wouldn't wait till the last week and try to read them all at once, because they're interesting. It's interesting to read them side by side. And just give you a little history there. John MacArthur, whom I know personally, wrote his book in the late 80s, and Zondervan published it, and it presents what we call Lordship Salvation, which is a chapter in our book here. But Zondervan didn't want to be viewed as holding just one side or presenting just one view. So they asked Zane Hodges, who was head of the New Testament department at Dallas Seminary at the time, to write another view, especially since MacArthur had openly attacked Louis Berry Schaeffer, the founder of Dallas Seminary, Charles Ryrie, Zane Hodges, Micah Corus, in his book. So Hodges wrote his rejoinder, which is absolutely free. So it's good to read those in contrast to one another. So now I want to jump into the meaning of this word saved. Pretty good discussion of it, I hope, in the introduction to our book. But we'll just do it ourselves right here. And as we get into this, I want to ask you a question. If I were to have a car wreck, and hypothetically, I'm not a Christian, but I do think God's out there. I've looked at intelligent design, and I don't think we humans are smart enough to put together what we see out there. And so I know there's a God out there, but I don't know him. I've got 3 minutes to live. You come upon me, you do know and have a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And I tell you, I'd like to know God. And so I want you to help me know him. And so I'm going to give you 3 Gospels to work with: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You can't use John, you can't use Acts, you can't use Romans, you can't use Ephesians. All you have is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's about 1/3 of the New Testament. And each one of those is a gospel, correct? So you would think you could lead me to Christ or lead me to heaven through those books. So I'm going to give you a chance to do that. Now, actually, I can't stop talking in this particular lecture, or my recorder will think I'm finished. So I can't give you time, but if I were doing this live, I'd be choking myself right now, having trouble breathing, and you would know when 3 minutes was up because I would die on the spot. Well, my point is, as you've gone through your mind, hopefully, in the few seconds I've given you, you realize that that's hard to do. You really can't It's not easy anyway. It can be done, but it's not easy to find verses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that tell us how to go to heaven. And we have a rule in Bible study called the law of proportions. And that rule is whatever gets the most ink, whatever's being written about the most, is what's being emphasized. Well, if you have three Gospels there, and it rarely ever tells us how to go to heaven, you can certainly agree, by the law of proportions, that that's not the emphasis of those three books at all. Whereas in John, the word believe occurs, I think it's 99 times. The word faith never occurs, but the word believe occurs 99 times. The most famous verse in the Bible, probably John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whosoever what? Believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So we go to John, some people use the Roman road, they call it, others use Ephesians, other verses to help lead people to Christ, but very few dip into Matthew, Mark, and Luke, except John MacArthur. And John Piper. They get most of their gospel from those three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right, I want to show you that that's could be problematic. So we're going to do some studies here. We're going to take this word saved and we're going to become a dictionary maker. Now, how do they make dictionaries? Well, the three most important rules of real estate are location, location, location. Something is worth, and its worth is determined much by its location. That's why when they establish the value of a house in this country, they find what they call comps, which are comparable sales near the house. What have other houses that are nearby, what have they sold for? So location. Well, it's the same in the Bible. We're not trying to figure out the value of words, but trying to find out their meaning. And you do this by studying their location. Another word for location is context. So the three most important rules of Bible study are context, context, context. And we'll see that over and over. So how do we do this study? Well, we just find this word in a concordance. So here's the word saved. We go over, its Greek root is sozo. We search this resource, and here are all the uses of the word saved. And here's how you're going to do it. You're going to just look at a word, try to get its context, and get some general meaning of what it means, and then put it down for your first meaning. So let's do that with Matthew 1:21. She will bring forth a son, you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now, what do you think that might be? Is that a spiritual salvation? Is that physical? What is that? Well, most people are going to say, well, that's spiritual. Okay, well, make Roman numeral 1 and say spiritual salvation. All right, verse 8, chapter 8, verse 25, Matthew. Then his disciples came to him and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. Well, we don't have to look that up, do we? We know that they're in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. The storms come up. They're afraid they're going to drown. So is this spiritual salvation? No, it doesn't take much thinking to realize this is physical salvation. All right, now you got another Roman numeral. You got two major meanings, spiritual salvation and physical salvation. Now you're going to find there are subcategories under those two broad categories. Under Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, you'll have ABCs. So let's go to the next one. This is 9:21. Matthew. For she said to herself, if only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. And then verse 22, the very next verse, Jesus turned around, and then he saw her, he said, when he saw her, he said, be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that hour. Okay, we got three meanings in a row. They're going to mean the same thing, aren't they? And none of them is translated saved. But if you go over here, you can see this little, what looks like, I guess that looks like an S, and that looks like a W. It's there, and it's there, and it's up here. So all three times you have that same Greek root. And I guess that's a quick dictionary. Well, that's just the rest of the context. but made well is translated that way. Why? Because of context. Three most important rules of real estate. And the context is obviously one of a woman with a physical issue. She comes to Jesus to be healed from her physical ailment. He believes that if she can touch his garment, she'll be healed physically. She does so, and Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." And the woman was made well from that hour. Now, even though this is faith without works, this isn't faith that's going to take her to heaven necessarily, is it? She believed that he could heal her. She probably thought he was the Messiah, so it may well be she already had spiritual salvation. At any rate, this is where she's physically healed. So you have three uses. All right, if you're a dictionary maker, so far you have Roman numeral 1 and put Matthew 1:21 there under spiritual salvation. Okay? Roman numeral 2, physical salvation. This is saved from physical death. So put Roman numeral 1 or 2, physical salvation. Under that put capital A and say from physical death. And then 121 is not from physical death, is it? Although it could result in that. We'll call this from physical disease. So under this category, you already have three uses. You've got 921 once, 922 twice, and you have 825 under Roman numeral B. I said Roman numeral B, I meant just big A. So big A was 825, big B, saved from physical disease, is 921 and 22 twice. Okay? Now I'm going to throw 1022 into a question mark right now. I'd like you to wrestle with this a while before we talk about it. But this may well turn out to be the most famous, not famous, but the most, he who endures to the end will be saved. We're going to see that this is the final arbiter of salvation, spiritual salvation for the Catholics, for the Calvinists, and for the Arminians. The Arminians think if you don't endure to the end of your life, they think this means the end of your life, that you lose your salvation. The Calvinists say if you don't endure faithful to the end of your life, you never had salvation. And the Catholics, since they believe in linear salvation on a timeline, think that if you don't endure to the end of your life, you simply won't be justified. They're not saying you had justification and lost it. They're not saying you never had or were involved in the process of justification. And they're just saying that if you didn't endure faithful to the end, that nullified all the character of Christ being built in you up to that point, and you wouldn't get to go to heaven. Okay, let's do some more. Chapter 14, verse 30. But when he saw the wind, oh, by the way, we will come back to 1022, believe me. I just don't want to jump into it right now because it's very important. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." What's that? Well, once again, they're on the lake. So this is not spiritual salvation, Roman numeral 1. This is physical salvation, Roman numeral 2. And under Roman numeral 2, is it A or B? A was saved from physical death. B was saved from physical disease. Once again, this is probably saved from drowning. So it's saved from physical disease. Excuse me, saved from physical death. Now 1625 falls in the same category as 1022, so I'm going to skip it again and come back to it. It's a special use that's very prominent in the New Testament, but takes a while to explain. So I'll come back to that one. 18, verse 11. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. Is that spiritual or physical? Well, that sounds spiritual, doesn't it? So put that under the spiritual salvation category. Okay. 1925. When his disciples heard it, they were greatly astonished, saying, "Who then can be saved?" This is the rich young ruler passage, and Jesus compares it to a rich man entering the kingdom of heaven, saying it's harder for him to do that than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And so we would say that's probably spiritual salvation, going to heaven. So you put that up under Roman numeral 1. Now here's he who endures to the end shall be saved. That passage we'll come back to again. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but the elect's sake those days will be shortened. Well, here we go into, we better look at the context a second there. Most of us who are dispensationalists, and this is a dispensational school, would say that this is the tribulation period. Verse 15 says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, and then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." This is a blow-up on the middle of the tribulation period, we think. The abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet was the Antichrist. Apparently Jesus believed in Daniel the prophet, as opposed to present-day scholars in Israel who think, in America and Europe, who think Daniel was a historian, not a prophet, that Daniel didn't really write the book, but someone else living around 150 BC saw the historical events and wrote it up, stuck Daniel's name on it. That's called a pseudonym, a false name for a book. Whenever you see him standing in the holy place, flee. So the thing that the Antichrist is going to do in the middle of the tribulation period is start killing people. He's going to try to kill all the Jews to finish what Hitler tried to do, and he's going to kill all believers, Gentile or Jewish. Now we know he doesn't get them all because the 144,000 are out there witnessing, and there's a great number that leave the tribulation alive. But they wouldn't leave unless those days were shortened. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. Well, that doesn't mean spiritual salvation, because lots of them who trust Christ are martyred. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Why? If God didn't put a time limit on the tribulation period, especially if you look at the plagues, we'll call them, at the end of the tribulation, no human being would be left alive. So the days are shortened. A time limit is put on them. So a remnant of believers out of the human race can go in and populate the 1,000-year period. That's what we think it means. So we would put this in the category of physical salvation, and under big letter A, saved from physical death.